The sermon is titled, Eat Your Neighbor or Yourself. Alex Jones made headlines in 2020, just as the pandemic had hit, and much of his statement I cannot read, but some highlights were, quote, "I'm starting to think about having to eat my neighbors. My daughters aren't going to starve to death. I'll eat my neighbors." Well, what's wrong with that? Our preacher continues to make observations about what he sees under the sun. As we go through Ecclesiastes, last week we noted that at the end of chapter 3, he began to look at all the oppressions that existed under the sun, namely the oppressions that came through those in positions of power, government leaders. This week, he turns his gaze towards the injustices that don't come from government, but come from the masses. He's looking at the population, and he's drawing the conclusion that much of the injustices we experience come not from our government, but actually from our fellow neighbors, from ourselves. If you look right there, it's in verses 4 and 5. Verse 4, "I saw all the toil and skill and work come from a man's envy or rivalry with his neighbor." Verse 5, "The fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh." So we might fancy ourselves better than Alex Jones because we won't literally eat our neighbor, but the word says we consume one another and ourselves in other ways. If we're to look out at the way human beings treat each other, there are ways you can watch us bite and devour. Whether it's a bitter rivalry to win or our own apathy, human culture outside of Eden is what we call a dog-eat-dog world. If we aren't bent on consuming our neighbor, our choices often end in us cannibalizing ourselves. Now, just a note about the structure of the passage. The preacher is observing three destructive tendencies common among mankind, and you can see them in the vanity statements. You see where vanity shows up in this passage? It shows up in three places, verse 4, verse 7, verse 16, and he's going to highlight in those verses, one, man's approach to work is anti-economy. That's one of the ways we consume each other, is the way we approach work. Number two, our approach towards others is anti-community. That's one of the ways we consume each other. Thirdly, our approach to correction is one of anti-correction. That's the third way we consume one another. So our work decisions, he's observing, destroy us normally. Our community decisions to isolate destroy us. And we refuse wise leadership as oppressive. Those are three ways we consume ourselves and one another, he's observing. And he links each of those with a vanity statement. It's a frustration that we can't resolve. But you'll notice also with each vanity statement comes a better statement. That is, those vanity statements are countered with an alternative. You see it there in verse 6, you see it there in verse 9, and you see it again in verse 13. So our text this morning has three pairs of destructive patterns that if we're going to be secularists and we're going to look out at life under the sun, we're going to cut ourselves off from God and look at how human beings operate, we see those three things. We are anti-economy, anti-community, and anti-correction, and he is going to commend to us a better way, which brings us back to the original question. What is wrong with eating our neighbor? Before I answer that, we need to look at where the debate has actually taken place, because this passage is just an observance, really. He doesn't go into what's going on behind the scene. So in order to bring out why he's having this conversation, we need to take a step back. We are in an age where tolerance demands that we believe all cultures are equal. But what the preacher is doing here with these vanity statements and these better statements is he's saying, actually, there are cultures better than others. There are patterns of work, there are patterns of laziness that are destructive. There are patterns of isolation that are destructive. There are patterns of ignorance that are destructive, and we can observe that if we look around. And culture wars exist ultimately because all of us recognize intuitively that some cultures are better than others. So it is a good and right assessment to evaluate cultures, but we need to ask, what is the culture that God commends? Now, this brings me to a quote by scholar Carl Trueman. He asked this in an article he wrote for First Things about 7 years ago. He says, "Is the culture war over?" Or to use less martial language, is Christian cultural engagement at an end? I believe the answer is yes, it is over. For to engage a culture, there must first be a culture to engage. We no longer have a culture, we have an anti-culture, end quote. And what Truman is getting at there, and what I want you to be aware of this morning, is the moves that have taken place in the West over the last century. The culture war is over, but it is not because Christianity has lost. The values of secularism have produced a vacuum. You are surrounded by a culture who proposes to you that there's no moral fabric to the universe. People are fluid, and all meta-narratives are false, except for that meta-narrative. That is, the culture war is over because secularism has produced what Truman calls an anti-culture. There is no culture that ought to exist. That is, you now live in a time of all-consuming anti-cultures that want to deconstruct instead of build anything in its place. That's the normative idea floating around now. We want to cast off all tradition. We want to cast off all historic ties. We want to cast off all national narratives. We are here to deconstruct everything. An anti-culture for Truman involves something, or it's this culture of embodying the death of society, built on sacred order, and it's the rise of another world built on rejection of any sacred order whatsoever. It is not that this world builds on second worlds, they repudiate them and demolish them. Why am I going into all this? I point this out to you to engage with our text this morning. One, because Christianity has always held the belief that behavior flows from belief. That is, behavior is not neutral. Behavior is grounded in conviction. But secondly, secularism attempts arbitrarily to tell us what we want is fine as long as we behave in certain ways. You can believe what you want as long as you behave according to the majority. Belief does not matter as long as you behave rightly before the powers that be. And you're also, and what's ultimately happening around us is you're being handed ethical bricks while the rebar is being removed, and you and I feel the cracks everywhere. In other words, what's happened over the last century is similar to, I think I've told this story before. I was at a church before this. We had a big gymnasium at the church where a wall began to crack from the bottom up almost all the way. And as they began to do the investigation, they saw that those walls were built, the bricks were all put there, but nobody ever put the rebar in the bricks. In other words, it was inevitable that it would all come crashing down. Now you are being given moral imperatives, but the underlying rebar of a meta-narrative has been stripped from it. And so ultimately what's happening is you are a part of an anti-culture. The anti-culture is built on tearing down, but it's not sure why. People today are not building, we are destroying. And in our passage, the preacher takes note of a similar destructive anti-culture that he observes under the sun, and he counters it with God-centered exhortations in a better way. Now, the reason I point all this out is because I don't want you to confuse his three better statements as isolated bricks that you can take from him and insert into your own worldview. His bricks are reinforced by the rebar of his belief in a God who oversees the universe. That is, these better structures are outside, even though we are outside of Eden, are still wise because God's wisdom reigns. But don't think for a moment that we can yank these bricks from him and try to push them into our own hodgepodge, our own story that we're trying to create. These bricks only make sense attached to the conviction that this is God's world. To give you an example of where this tension plays out, you'll often hear that, why should I believe in God instead of the flying spaghetti monster? I don't believe in God in the same way I don't believe in a flying spaghetti monster. And the assumption is that God and the flying spaghetti monster have made equal contributions to human history. But the problem with that debate is that there's a problem that arises when we ask the question, what has been built in human culture out of belief in the flying spaghetti monster? Where in human history has belief in a flying spaghetti monster built hospitals, built relief efforts, built national constitutions? Where have those things been built because people have taken hope in the promises of a flying spaghetti monster? The fact is, human history is filled with shelters, hospitals, ideals, and laws, but they are grounded in the existence of God. So Truman notes again, the non-existence of God is not like the non-existence of unicorns or centaurs or fairies or flying spaghetti monsters. Nothing significant has been built on the supposition that those mythological creatures exist. To dispense with God, however, is to destroy the very foundations on which a whole world of metaphysics and morality has been constructed and depends. So in summary, all of this to say, belief in God drives building. Convictions construct cultures, while secularism devours. So I return to my question. What's wrong with eating your neighbor? The answer lies in our view of the world. But it might be easy and tempting and even right to immediately take a shot at abortion or transgenderism. But this passage this morning hits much closer to home. This passage in The Preacher is detecting an anti-culture in the way that we work, in the way that we isolate, in the way that we ignore wisdom. So let's look at these three anti-cultures together this morning. The first anti-culture is anti-economy, verses 4 to 6. The preacher says, "Then I saw that all toil and all skill in work come from a man's envy of his neighbor. This also is vanity and a striving after wind. The fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh. Better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands of toil and a striving after wind." I call this anti-economy because the biblical view of economy is not reduced to gross domestic product. It includes the well-being of our neighbors. Jesus, remember, summarized the law in 2 parts. First, we love God. Secondly, we love neighbor. And therefore, the command not to covet is a culture rooted first in the love of God, second in the love of neighbor. But if you notice verse 5, the preacher observes what the normative behavior or the normative motive behind labor is in Israel. See what he says there? Israel's laborers are typically motivated by envy or rivalry. The reason they work as much as they do is because they are in competition with one another. Verse 5 is referring to the adage, keeping up with the Joneses, which is a bit ironic given the Alex Jones quote. There's something about the human condition that does not need to see another phone or car advertisement in order to make a purchase. We simply need to see our neighbor with it. In marketing, we call this a purple cow. A purple cow is a product that is so remarkable that it sells itself because the community talks about it. But in reality, it isn't the item for sale that causes such an overflow of buying. It's actually our heart's condition to want what our neighbor has. So what the preacher is saying this morning is that when you look around in the world and you see why people work as much as they do, one of the regular reasons people work so much is because outside of Eden, we are no longer driven by love. We are driven by rivalry. We want what they have. We have one eye on our bank account, one eye on our neighbor's things, and we try to stretch that bank account to match what the community has. Proverbs 14, verse 30, Solomon tells his son that rivalry makes the bone rot. In other words, that one eye on the bank account, one eye on your neighbor is like watching an animal decompose. Except the animal is not an animal, it's you and me, and it's the way we stretch ourselves thin to have more and more of what we see all around us. I discovered this personally when I first bought my home in Louisville, Kentucky. I was paired up with a realtor who had been a pastor, and so we hit it off well. We talked life and we talked ministry. But when it came time to sign the contract for the home, the seller's realtor had made an error in the contract, and they actually were selling it to us for $10,000 less than what they had initially asked, to our advantage. I had suggested to the realtor we need to contact them and have them redo it, and his counsel to me was, don't say anything. This is how the industry works. This happens. He had forgotten that there was a human being on the other end of that deal. He was not driven by love for neighbor, but by competition and destruction. And it was by the Lord's grace that I had any desire to do the right thing. I do not mean to excuse myself. I have a competitive heart. But in that situation, I remember being struck. Here is a man who has pastored God's people, and he has no second thoughts about taking advantage of a chance to save $10,000 at the cost of another. We're driven by competition and rivalry. How much then of our work hours are driven by the need to get the next best thing? Be it a car, be it a smartphone, home. How much are we stretching ourselves to have simply because others have it? Now, the temptation here is to hear this and go, yeah, that's right. We're gonna forget the whole system. We're going to reject it. You see it down in verse 5? He goes from one extreme to the next. We go from working all the time to keep up with our neighbors to the other extreme, the person who folds his hands. Folding one's arms is an idiom for the sloth. It's somebody who is deliberately unemployed or deliberately not working. It might seem that verse 4 is suggesting that a free market is evil, but the problem isn't the economic system, it's the heart that disregards one's neighbor. But it's not only the disregard for neighbor that's problematic, it's disregard for self. Refusing to work here in verse 5 is described as what? You are cannibalizing yourself. In 1972, a Uruguayan flight carrying a rugby team crash-landed in the Andes Mountain. In order to survive, the survivors made the difficult decision of consuming the flesh of those who died in the crash. And that was the only way they survived. They had to eat the deceased passengers. But if that's repulsive to you, verse 5 is saying that sloth, deliberate worklessness, is just as much cannibalizing yourself. You are destroying yourself when you choose not to exercise yourself in labor. So work is good, your neighbor needs your work, and you need your work. Remember what Paul says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. He wants them to love more excellently. And so what he does is he tells them that in order to live well before outsiders, they should all go and get a job. They should learn to work with their hands. Well, I wonder if, like me, you're prone, whether it's your job or your housework, to grow embittered because you wished you could do other things. See, work is good in the biblical worldview. Work is a pre-fall reality. It's not something to be despised. And so this passage causes us to ask the question, what's the alternative between working to destroy our neighbor and sloth that destroys ourselves? Well, the answer is down there in verse 6. Better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toil and a striving after the wind. In other words, what he's saying is, you see the contrast there? It's better to have one hand on rest and one hand on work rather than having both hands on rest or both hands on work. a good culture for mankind is not endless work or endless rest, but one who can do both. That we would live lives that have a balance of both work and rest. It was Blaise Pascal who argued all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room. Instead, we toil endlessly on in discontentment, or out of fear of failure, we never move at all. You remember the prayer in Proverbs chapter 30, verses 7 to 9? 2 things I ask of you, God. Deny them not to me before I die. Remove far from me falsehood and lying. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is needful for me, lest I be fool and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of my God. There is a great culture to build of rhythm and rest, but it depends on trusting the Lord. Remember what Jesus told us, only with difficulty will a rich person enter the kingdom of heaven. It's not because riches are bad, but because of our hearts that so competitively seek to have them. Are we setting examples in our community church of how to work and rest well? Are we encouraging our neighbors to learn to rest with us? Do we have enough time in our rhythms to even be hospitable to our neighbors because we are teaching them the glory of both rest and work? So the first anti-culture is our anti-economy competitiveness and slothfulness. The second anti-culture is our tendency towards anti-community, verses 7 to 12. Again, I saw vanity under the sun. One person who has no other, either son or brother, yet there is no end to all his toil. And his eyes are never satisfied with riches, so that he never asks, for whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? This also is vanity and an unhappy business. 2 are better than 1, because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who's alone when he falls, and has not another to lift him up. Again, if 2 lie together, they keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, 2 will withstand him. A 3-fold cord is not quickly broken. If you look down at verse 8, the vanity observed, the enigma here is that there is a person who works tirelessly, and yet he has no family or community by which he is supporting with all that work and toil. He works well beyond his need because he cannot discover why he's working the way that he does. Their toil is so endless, they cannot even come to themselves and ask the question, why am I working this much? Why am I just going and going and going and going? Like the lazy, deliberately unemployed, the one who works only to build up themselves is seeking their own harm instead of their pleasure. And they must do so, as verse 8 says, because they are never satisfied with what they've been given. You see, their work is disconnected from their care for others. They cannot settle, and they cannot build that all their labors might become a means to hospitality, both towards themselves and towards their community. They consume and they consume and they consume for themselves and are never satisfied. And what he's getting at here is that their work is a cover because they deliberately choose isolation. See, it's not just people who don't have family who do this. How often do parents do this? They go and they go and they go and they go, and their kids never know them and they never know their kids because work is a means of their own isolation. And you can see that isolation is the concern because verses 9 to 12 counter it with better statements that are all about the gift of community. Verses 9 to 12 reflect on benefits of being in community. The reward of working, whether with a household or co-workers, is that it is more beneficial. And perhaps it's in overall productivity, it's a given, but it's also the insurance that comes with it. You see it in verse 10? In the ancient world, there were no phone or computer jobs, so to fall at work meant to risk becoming ineligible for work for life. But how much better it is to have one working with you who could save you from a lifelong injury. Verse 11, in the ancient world, staying warm was made possible by pyromaniacs or proximity. It was not uncommon to lay down for warmth's sake without other intentions. If you didn't have a fire, you had no one who could build a fire for you there, what would you do? You lay next to somebody. What a gift community is, both for physical warmth, but emotional and social warmth. We need that. Verse 12 speaks to what we mean in the 21st century when we fear walking to your car alone. In this case, in the ancient world, travel along the road was dangerous in the event that you get attacked by thieves. So what insurance do you have against thieves? A friend. Even better, 3. If there's 2 of you, 3 of you is even stronger. And the point here that the king is observing is that we tend towards isolation, and I think one of the main ways we do that is through technology. Just like work, technology has become another escape. We can gain the sense or the reward of connectivity all day long without actually having to know each other. And the point that he's making is that deliberate isolation is an anti-culture. Today, we often cloak it with the language of self-care, meaning we just don't want to give ourselves to be known. You see, in churches all the time, with the desire to watch services from home, we prefer online communities and online pastors. That way we don't ever really have to hold each other accountable or know each other well. What the preacher's getting at is that self-imposed isolation isn't a neutral reflex. It is anti-community. And to be anti-community is to be anti-culture. And the biblical worldview teaches this as folly. Remember Proverbs 18:1, whoever isolates themselves seeks his own desire. He breaks out against all sound judgment. It's a choice not to have the counsel of others in your life by keeping them at a distance. And you break out against sound judgment because you're the only person you listen to. And that's a deliberate move to remain isolated and not be known. An isolating culture, we can say, from the authority of the word, is a destructive culture. As one commentator noted, the first biblical insight we must come to grips with if we're to pursue an alternative social science is this: God created humans as a social being. God designed the human being to be a relational creature. And note this point as well. Humankind was created to relate to other beings. It was not an accident. It was not the result of sin. It was an intentional, creational given. Is life more difficult if you open yourself up to others? Absolutely. So I'm not asking you to make your life easier. The text is saying make your life harder by inviting others into it. But the biblical worldview says that risk is both good and necessary. Community is good because God is relational by his very nature. The Trinity isn't just some far-off, impractical doctrine. It is the reality that God, by his very nature, is one essence, but 3 persons. He is a communal God in eternal, delightful, joy-filled fellowship with himself forever, which overflows in the creation of creatures who delight to know one another. You were made to be a relational being. Therefore, a communal culture is far superior than the anti-culture of isolating individualism. Maybe 2 applications from there. 1, are we open to being in community with one another? Are you marked by rhythms of getting to know your brothers and sisters in this room? Or are you quickly doing work for one another without taking time to be known? Secondly, to our older members, and I don't just mean seniors, I mean those who aren't kids, so to the adults, I should say. How are we doing teaching our younger members to know each other well? See, there's this assumption that if your child isn't in public school, they're not going to be nurtured well. But I don't think society was ever designed for kids to be the primary nurturers of kids. Kids mature when adults take responsibility to nurture kids. And how much more that should be so here in the church, right? Titus 2, the older train up the younger. In Proverbs, the wise, if you want to make your child wise, you have to put him around the wise. So church, do we as adults take responsibility to raise up the young, to build relationships with them, to teach them how to know us, and to teach them how to know one another. It's up to us to set that example and to do it. The last anti-culture that is observed here is anti-correction, verses 13 to 16. Better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice. For he went from prison to the throne, though in his own kingdom he had been born poor. I saw all the living who move about under the sun, along with that youth who was to stand in the king's place. There was no end of all the people, all of whom he led, yet those who come later will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and a striving after the wind. You might note that this story sounds a little bit like Joseph and David, even more like Christ, who we know went from poverty to king over all. There was an old king in the land, is his point, and he was a fool, because in his old age he did not know how to receive counsel. He had made himself irrelevant to his people because he could not listen. But advice here, or counsel here, is not only old advice. Israel's kings were to lead because they were being advised by Torah. So we can make the mistake here to assume that refusing any counsel is bad, but the virtue of counsel in Scripture is not that all opinions are equal. It is wisdom, saturated by the word, that the king was to be heeding. This king had long failed to lead or to learn from biblical counsel. And so the preacher retells the story of his being uprooted by a young, poor man, but he was wise. He knew Torah. And though he had been poor in the old king's kingdom, his wisdom had quickly exalted him to replace the old king. You feel the echoes of Joseph in a sense. But what we see here is that being old isn't a virtue by itself, neither is being young. But it is often the case in our old age that we grow hardened to love and to listen. The virtue of being old is only virtuous if we have learned to be formed by the Lord to give wise counsel to the younger. That's the gift of being older, is that you've had the years to embrace the word and learn to apply it, that you might then pass its seasoned wisdom back to the next generation. And the hope of Psalm 92 that Brother Nate read for our call to worship reminds us of the hope that we have in the Lord when we grow old. It says, "The righteous flourish like the palm tree and grow like a cedar in Lebanon. They are planted in the house of the Lord. They flourish in the courts of our God. They still bear fruit in old age. They are ever full of sap and green." What Solomon is observing here is that we must not absolutize age. It is folly to evaluate a person merely by whether or not they are old or young. How often the old become hardened to wisdom, and there are many times where a young king or leader is raised up who is filled with wisdom, and vice versa happens as well. But overcoming such an anti-culture isn't very easy. That's his point. We must not end there. Look at verses 15 to 16. Though the masses initially loved the young and wise king, the people eventually refused his wisdom. The young and wise became just as irrelevant as the old and foolish king. It isn't just the old king in this passage who's rejecting wisdom. The preacher's observing that the masses of people are rejecting wisdom. The cycle of going from ruler after ruler, this one will say, but this one will do that, and yet the people grow frustrated with the next ruler just as much as they were with the one before. Mankind's proclivity towards rejecting wisdom is all too common under the sun, and you see it in how they respond to the rulers that are over them. I know it doesn't happen among us, but how many times have people around us promised themselves, if we can get the White House this time, this president will fix everything? It isn't wise to make that promise because we've demonstrated ourselves to be allergic to wisdom. Our presidents haven't solved the folly among us. No matter who you put up there, we will continue to demonstrate this pattern. Are there marks of anti-correction among us, church? In particular, are we a people who reject the wisdom of the word for our own ideas? Is there a humility about us that allows us to be shaped by the word, both in conversation, in small groups, in lessons, and here on Sunday mornings? Or are we constantly trying to change the word to fit our assumptions? In summary, I've mentioned three anti-cultures: anti-economy, anti-community, anti-correction. The point that the king is observing is that apart from God, under the sun, these three things mark community among us. In Reineke's book, 12 Ways Your iPhone is Changing You, the thesis, there's a copy of it out there on the shelf, and I definitely recommend it, but the thesis of his second chapter is that our tech choices impact our flesh and blood relationships. He writes, quote, "We are quick to believe the lie that we can simultaneously live a divided existence, engaging our phones while neglecting others." I wonder right now, have you thought about the fact that your tech habits shape your flesh and blood relationships? And you might be tempted to say that they don't. So what Reineke does is he goes on to mention texting and driving, or calling and driving. And while for most of us, I think, none of us have ever gotten in an accident because of that, you notice how quickly we're willing to put our flesh and blood at risk that we might have a little more digital stimulation, whether it be a text or browsing. Our habits impact our community, is his point. We live in a world, then, that is already patterned for us. It's a pattern we can't escape. Therefore, we must make cultural judgments. And the word says ceaseless work, laziness, isolation, and refusing counsel are another set of those vanities under the sun that we can't solve in our own strength. In fact, he says, it is a destructive anti-culture. But the question I'll close with is, if you're a secularist, why should we build anything different? I don't think any of us, or at least most of us in here, are not secularists. So I'll ask the church, why should we build a different world? Why should we build a world where economy includes the good of our neighbor? And why should we build a world where community is prioritized, that we draw towards one another? Why should we build a world that heeds wisdom? Well, remember what Christ did? John chapter 6, 54 to 56. "Whoever feeds on my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day. For my flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. Whoever feeds on my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me, and I in him." Do you see the difference between life under the sun and Christ? What does Jesus say to a world that consumes itself? Instead, he came and he says, "Consume me." He says, "Consume me." Christ came and says, do not cannibalize yourself. Do not cannibalize your neighbor. In fact, you have done those things, is what he told us. We have rebelled against our God, and it has demonstrated in the way we have treated neighbor. But Jesus came and he said, instead, consume me. I will provide what you cannot provide for yourself. I will stand before God and take the judgment for your sin. And now you respond by turning to God and joining this community called the church, where you demonstrate that sort of love for one another. Do not cannibalize yourself or your neighbor. Consume Christ, which is a strange and deliberately provocative picture. So how does this help us build our lives differently? Because as God, Jesus came to the earth, and he came not to consume us. He came specifically as one not like us. And he did this by, instead of consuming us, giving up his body in our place. And what that means through Colossians is that in Christ, God is reconciling all things to himself, which means the bedrock to the universe is not a neutral or indifferent material called matter. The bedrock of the universe is a God who loves by giving instead of consuming. And through Christ's death and resurrection for your sin, you and I are provided for so that we as Christians might build another culture amongst ourselves where biting and devouring are done away with. To be clear, I'm not calling for us to reform the culture on our own. I think we should do good where we can, but the application here is specifically about how the church treats one another. And in secondary application is how we interact in the world around us. But the world should sense their devouring of one another. They should begin to see it, and I think there are ways that they can. But then there should also be this community growing in the world that is like a light. It's like a light to the world of a different way. And that different way is that among us, they see people who no longer are devouring one another. We have reasons to devour one another. We grow frustrated, we're sinners, we hate, we make mistakes. But at the end of the day, we make the choice to be devoured along with Christ, that we might love and provide for one another, that the world might hear and learn more about Jesus. So I'm not speaking of what nations and governments can build. I'm speaking specifically of what you and I can build uniquely because of what Christ has done. So Christian, you shouldn't eat your neighbor and you shouldn't eat yourself, because you now are upheld by a God who had provided for us. And how does the Lord remind us of that? Through this table down here in front of us. Let's pray and then take of Christ's body and blood together.